E te moana koutou ngā kai pōhiri, ngā kai karanga, me pēnea ke ngā kai mihi ki te hunga nei. Ka mihi rā te ngākau ahakoa i taiturei timai. E harei te mea kāre he kaupapa mo tērā, hoi no i muri i roto kea i taku rūma e tuhi ana i taku kauhau. Nā reira mō taku he, ko te mōhio, tānui te arohau tauranga moana ki au ki Ngāti Pūkenga, ki au ki Manaia, ki au ki te whetū o te rangi. Nā reira, kei aku whanaunga, kei aku huanga tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Mabel, I'll give you an answer at the end. That's an extraordinary introduction. That was an introduction that was longer than my paper. My cousin Awanui said that he doesn't speak English very much in these occasions, and you can see why. The comments he made in Māori were extraordinarily beautiful. And it's a great pity that for those of you who don't have a facility in Māori, there wasn't a translation of it, because if there was, you would understand several of the points that I'm going to make. But he started with the way good orators on the marae always start. The identification of his mana in the area. Identified all of the mountain peaks through the area, and explained the historical event associated with each peak. He did what orators always do on the marae, referred to the great prophets and rendered their messages relevant to the subject matter of the meeting. And his plea was a plea, in some ways actually, a plea for mercy. His last comment that he didn't translate, I'm sure he didn't translate on purpose, was that the law has really been an adze to him. And the blade has been buried deep in his head, he said. And there's all sorts of cultural illusion around that. Getting a weapon that caves the most tapu part of your body in is the ultimate humiliation. And he said that you must take the words of Te Kōti, let laws of liberation undo laws of oppression. Ma te ture anō, te ture e aki. He challenged you to take that blade from his head, reshape it, and turn it into a weapon of freedom. I thought it was a really powerful message, but he butchered it in English, unfortunately. Environmental management has some big challenges, as you'll know. Much better than me as a common or ordinary garden High Court trial judge. You've got to deal with climate change, you've got biodiversity, massive challenges. And you've got that great challenge, the fitting of humans onto and into this planet. This gathering is about the voice of the first humans to arrive here, at least the descendants of those people, the place of that voice. And the place of that voice, I think, ultimately tests the durability and resilience of the management systems of the 21st century, and that's where I want to sort of work in the comments that I'm going to make. I'm going to start with some big context. One of the problems in the various areas of specialised law, science, management expertise is that we tend to stick to our silos and not understand that actually this is a part of a much larger, much richer conversation. So ask your patience while I try and build up some context here. See, my perspective on things is that law in Aotearoa was laid down in three layers. The first law of Aotearoa, about 1200 AD, through to about 1840. These are rough dates. Kupe is said to have arrived around 1200 AD on his voyaging ship, Matawhaurua, with his wife, Kura Marotini, their nieces, Matu and Makaro, and 25 others who had been mostly from their own village, Awanuiarangi, and about 13 from the village of Pikopikoifiti in Hawaii. Made this extraordinary voyage, 3,000 odd kilometres. The first Polynesians to cross the tropical zones into the temperate zone and to have to fight the Roaring Forties in order to find this place. A big place, but the most challenging trip, the anthropologists say, in fact that rock star anthropologist Jared Diamond says, the most challenging trip the human species had ever made. He says that of the peopling of Polynesia generally, but the trip from Hawaii to the top of the North Island was the most challenging of those most challenging journeys. And of course he brought with him a system of science, a system of social management, and a system of law, the Polynesian system. So that's the first layer. The second layer was the law of New Zealand, 1840 odd through to about 1985. The colonial law, the law that saw this collision between itself and the first law as an intentional train wreck, as a train wreck on purpose. And then the third law, which I think is about circa 1985 through to the present, that I call the law of Aotearoa New Zealand. The third layer, where something quite fundamental has changed in the way we manage that collision. And the reason that I think it's important for you to hear that message is that resource management is the very point, the very sharp tip of the management of that collision. That's where it all effectively started. So some patience while I build that context up. So Kupe's, the first layer, Kupe's law was Polynesian. I wish I had actually some slides that I was going to put up, and I brought a little stick and did all the things that you're supposed to do if you're going to do a keynote speech. And I brought my Ministry of Justice provided laptop in order to make some changes to some slides that I was going to steal from somewhere else. And you can see that I don't use the laptop very much because I couldn't remember the password to get into it. So I do have some slides, but you can't see them and neither can I because I couldn't get them done last night. So you're just going to get me, I'm afraid. I ask for your patience. So these Polynesians bring this system of law, essentially a kinship-based system of law, in which memory of your descent defines your rights and responsibilities. So your certificate of title is your whakapapa in this Polynesian system. And this is true throughout Polynesia, not just here, everywhere. Kinship is everything in that system. And that's the system Kupe brings. But he and his descendants, not actually Kupe himself, because when you think about it, Kupe wasn't a Maori. He was a Hawaiian. His grandchildren were Maori, and his great-grandchildren even more so, and his great-great-grandchildren even more so, and so on. And this is the point. The system of law and the systems of science and the language that they built up here was unique, is unique, so that they became Maori here. They weren't Maori before they came, they became Maori here. So in a sense, in an anthropological sense, it's quite wrong to say we're all settlers, because the settlers who came here, those first settlers who came here were Hawaiians and they became Maori, just as the first English settlers were English for the first couple of generations and then they became New Zealanders. In response, in both cases, in response to the whenua and the moana, in response to the land and the sea, something fundamentally changes. about these people in both of those waves, actually, when you think about it, both of those waves of colonization. And one thing that does change fundamentally is the system of law that Kupe brought. Still very much a kin-based system. This idea of legal principles around the centrality of kinship and the careful attention to relationships. This is a system of law that hates division. It handles division very badly. What it loves is connection. And in that little kernel, actually, is the opposition between it and the Western system, which loves division. Its genius is the ability to divide, simplify, classify, and identify. The Māori system hates that. That's why, these Māoris who did the pōhiri here all said to you, welcome my relations. You're not related to any of them. But that's what they said. Welcome, here, my relations. Because they would never say, welcome here, strangers. Welcome here, people who have no connection to this place. By this pōhiri, you are connected. So, your right to land begins with this idea, this legal idea of take tupuna, ancestral root of title. In order to have title, you must remember your line to the person who was the first owner, whoever that might be, to Kupe, to Hoturoa if you're from Tainui, to Toroa, like me if you're from Mātātua, to Tamate Kapua, like me if you're from Te Arawa, and so on. Take those lines back to the original, because that's your title. That's your right, and it's also your responsibility to care for all of your relations. A legal responsibility, not just a cultural idea, but a legal responsibility. But descent isn't enough for title to land. You must maintain your relationship with the land in order to maintain your title. The idea, the legal principle of ahika. Your fires must burn in the land in order to maintain your relationship with it. You must continue to tend the land in order to maintain your ancestral right. And then there are these, the great Māori civil and tort remedy of muru, a criminal and tort remedy, probably mashed into one of muru. If you wrong somebody in terms of Kupe's law, then the person who has been wronged is entitled to tax your property in the traditional system of muru. But the interesting thing, and this is where kinship becomes important, the interesting thing is it's not just the person wronged, and it's not just the wrongdoer, as it would be in modern criminal law, in fact, English criminal law in the 19th century. In English criminal law and in English tort law, the wrongdoer is the individual, and the individual is responsible, and the person who is damaged is the person who benefits from damages or whatever it might be, restoration, reparation, and so on. In the Māori system, in a kinship-based system, no. In fact, the individuals involved are by the by. If it's a small wrong, it's family to family. If it's a big wrong, it's hapu to hapu. And if it's a big wrong, it's iwi to iwi. Nobody exists as an individual, and no right exists, almost no right exists as an individual right. And kinship is a bigger idea than even that. We call it in Māori whanaungatanga. Familyness, literally familyness. It's interspecies. So, in traditional storytelling, greetings are given to other species as if they are your relations, and the genealogy that connects you to that species is given. And these genealogies are well known, even today. And they're not even just between animate things. They're with inanimate things as well. And there are legal principles around your responsibilities to inanimate objects by virtue of your relationship with them. The greatest story, of course, is Rata, who chopped down the tree without having asked properly of his relation whether his relation was prepared to give itself up. And wakes up in the morning, the tree's back up again, and some of you, many of you will know the story. Chops it down, doesn't ask the right question, doesn't seek permission. Wakes up in the morning, tree's back up. Chops it down again, wakes up in the morning, the tree's back up. Decides something's wrong here, and sneaks up at night to find out what's going wrong. And the forest insects and birds are rebuilding the tree. And as they're doing it, they're performing a karakia. I can't remember the details of it, but rata ware, ka tūtua noa koe, ka something noa koe, ka wheki, ka wheka. They're performing this karakia, saying basically, rata, you stupid man. You have not performed the correct rites. You have not asked for the correct permission. You may not do this. Stop it now, stop it now. The tree stands. Now, the object lesson here is that the tree is his relation. And the whakapapa is well known. Tāne Mahuta, the tree god, the forest god, has a daughter who produces the first human. So in that way the trees and humans are closely related. And then they hand him over the asking for permission. It's a karakia that's still well known, and you know on the maraes, good orators will perform it in order to remind of those obligations. Ka kāri ki pō whai tere ko tia ko te pū, wai hui ko nei, ko tia ko te kauru, wai hui ko nei. E ai huki ki te umua, te tuhiki hei rai tai ki ngā pūkenga, ki ngā wānanga, ki ngā tauira. It's actually the story of the cutting down of the tree in proper fashion. Reminding of kaitiakitanga obligations. Why? Because this is a kinship-based system. And kinship and connection is everything. And not just that. The great beauty of this system that Awa was talking about is that kinship is also used as an intellectual metaphor. So when I was taught as a young, rather useless taiaha man, unlike Awa who's very good at it, the tohunga who taught me all the some of the moves that he knew. He knew a lot of moves. I only learned a few. But he taught me the ranking of the moves by whakapapa. So that this is the senior sibling in this clutch of moves. This is the one junior, and so on and so forth. And this move married this move and produced these moves, and so on. That whole area of martial art is described by kinship. Why? Because it's a useful technique, I think, for the wielder of the weapon to be able to decide what is the best move, and if that move's not available, then to take the next one, and to take the next one, and take the next one. So you take the junior move only if you've got no choice. The old fella taught me. But the interesting thing, looking back at it now, is that he taught it to me that way. That this was not just a way of ordering human relationships, interhuman relationships, or even a way of ordering human relationships with the environment. It was a way of ordering knowledge itself. That's how shot through the Māori and Polynesian system kinship is. It is, I think, and this is why I've spent probably a little too long on it, the glue that keeps the system working. So, whanaungatanga was as important for Māori family law as it is for burial law, taking the Takamore case, for those of you who know about it, for criminal law, for the law of civil wrongs, muru, and of course, for environmental law. It is the central idea in Māori environmental law. And then there's the idea of mana. If you move from whanaungatanga to mana, the concept of leadership, and interestingly, in an utterly kinship-based system, the idea of individual dignity, which when you think about it is kind of counterintuitive, but there it is. The idea of leadership and individual dignity. A paradox, I think, a beautiful paradox in what is essentially a collective culture. There's this great saying in Māori, which is one of my favourites, called te kaia te rangatira he kōrero. Literally, the food of chiefs is talk. But what it means is the job of leadership is to persuade. And that tells you something quite fundamental about the way Māori power is wielded. Despite its kinship basis, it's not the kind of absolute right of monarchs idea that one sees in medieval and then later Europe until the Reformation. It's a different idea. And that's because this is whakapapa in small communities where everybody is related. You may be the chief, but all of those old people over there, they're your uncles and aunties. For every chief, there's 20 Mabels. It's true. And they're scary. She's not even the scariest. You should come to Manaia. So, this is a system which prides itself in its democratic ideals within the kinship matrix. And then there's tapu, the law of tapu, much misunderstood, the spiritual dimension in Kupe's system of law that Awa was talking about. Behavioural controls, go there, don't go there, touch that, don't sit on tables. You know, even in modern times, don't sit on tables, don't step across my leg, don't you ruffle my hair is tapu. Don't walk into that house with your shoes on. You're taking mud in. Of course, the practical reason you're taking mud in, but in the Māori legal system, that is tapu, a form of tapu. Don't you talk to me until you've had a pōhiri. Why? Because you're tapu. Now, literally, it's true. You are tapu. Why? Because we haven't shared breath. We haven't shared breath. Most people think that the word hongi means to press noses. And of course you do press noses, but the word hongi means to breathe in. Hongi, puha. And the reason that hongi is called hongi, you know, on the hongi line like we did before, was that the whole idea is that you share breath with with the home people. And in that, you remove your tapu. And this is how, in the old days, this is how Kupe made sure that visitors weren't going to kill him. But the legal metaphor used for that was the law of tapu. You better wait till we can formally welcome you and make sure you're the right, you know, you're the goods, and you're not going to use that taiaha before we can be friends together. And the ultimate equalizing of that tapu, the ultimate removal of that tapu, is that. Incredibly unhygienic. But, you know, if you've been on a hongi line and done it properly, you realise how close that makes you to the person that you're hongiing. It's not just a it's a. That's all about the law of tapu. And that brings me to the law of utu. Another principle greatly misunderstood. The obligation of reciprocity. Of course, we all think it's revenge, and to some extent it is. That's about that much of utu. But it's the bit that, you know, makes all the Māori versions of the cowboys and Indians stories, so people concentrate on that. But actually, it's the law of balance and imbalance. The same thing, you know, that hongi thing is about that. Maintaining balance through, in this case, the sharing of breath. Actually, removing any chance of conflict through the sharing of breath. That's all about this idea of utu and balance. And that's because the Māori system, apart from being a whanaungatanga system, is utterly obsessed with duality, with opposites in tension. Utterly obsessed with that idea. You see that in the pōhiri process for most tribes anyway. Women will have the initial oratory role in calling. It's a form of oratory in its own right. The men will have the speaking oratory role. And that male-female yin-yang thing in tension is something deeply fundamental. Awa, when he ended his comments, he said, may your meeting, may your conference go well from the earth to the sky. Kia pai tā koutou hui mai te rangi ki te whenua. Now, if you said that in English, may your meeting go well from the earth to the sky, it sounds a bit strange. But in Māori, it's a really cool thing to say because of the oppositionality of earth and sky. It's constantly repeated in oratory and in song. Mai te rangi ki te whenua. Kore pai ki a koe, mai te rangi ki te whenua. I do not like you from the earth to the sky. Kei te aroha atu au ki a koe, mai te rangi ki te whenua. I love you from the earth to the sky. Mai te kino ki te pai, mai te tapu ki te noa. From good to bad, from sacred to profane, from earth to sky, from water to land. All of these ideas are constantly brought up in this legal system as it tries to maintain balance in oppositional ideas. I think there's something probably deeply Asian about that, but I'm not an expert in those things. And then there's this idea, the last of them that I want to talk about, which you'll know about because it's in the Act, kaitiakitanga. The obligation to nurture and care for one's own. In the Act it's called the ethic of stewardship. But, and it kind of is stewardship, but you've got to understand stewardship in that system of blood link. So that kaitiakitanga, you owe your kaitiakitanga obligation to that river because you are related to it. You know, people stand and refer to their mountains. E koro mauau e tu. Old man mauau, the mount. E tu. Stand here, stand here. E koro hikurangi. E whae tongariro. You refer to them as ancestors, as parents. Because in the whakapapa system that makes the world work, and therefore in the legal system that makes the world work, they are. So kaitiakitanga is a stewardship idea, but you have to understand it's stewardship in the same sense that you have stewardship of your children. So if we wouldn't question our responsibilities to our children. Well, occasionally I do with my son, but we wouldn't question our responsibilities to our children because it's natural. Well, in this bigger kinship system, that's the idea that kaitiakitanga is trying to convey. The idea of deep obligation arising from that whanaungatanga relationship. Finally, these, of course, I'm talking about a system of big ideas and values, not a system of normative rules that we raised and me trained in the Western system are used to. It's quite hard to find hard and fast rules in Kupe's system. Not impossible, but quite hard. So it's a flexible consensus-based system, I guess in the end, that defers to the collective. So that's the first law. It's taken me a while. The second law is what came in 1840. And the reason I wanted to refer briefly to the second law is to kind of underscore how different they really were. First of all, this was a system of law that effectively Cook and Hobson bring, dispensed through a central, relatively impersonal officialdom. By the 19th century, actually the English system was not like that 200 years earlier, but by the 19th century they were the Queen's judges and the Parliament was sovereign according to Albert Venn Dicey anyway. And the people that made the rules for you and the people that enforced them were not related to you. So law was normative, rule-based, and handed out from the centre. And that law had by this time come to deify the individual and individual autonomy. Of course, this is after the French and American revolutions, and they had a great affirming effect on those ideas that were developing through the Renaissance and the Reformation. So there is a great focus on the individual mana, and the autonomy of the individual to do that which he or she wishes. Well, actually, he in those days, she much later. And thirdly, this second form of law decided that it would define economic, social, and political relationships through the idea of contract. so that obligations and rights were not inherent in pre-existing relationships, they were created by relationships freely entered into by autonomous individuals called contracts. And that's why, certainly in the Anglo-common law world, private law of contract is far more important than any public law ideas. And this is kind of a subset of that idea. Environmental relationships were defined almost entirely through the concept of the property right, the Lockean property right. Now, as I've described them anyway, and I know I've kind of dumbed down both, but I don't have a lot of time. But those are that's the essential shape of the two systems, and if you look at them that way, they couldn't possibly have been more different. They couldn't possibly have been more oppositional. And in 1840 or thereabouts, a collision begins. The idea was that that collision would be managed and mediated through another document, actually a contract. So it worked in the Western system, and an arrangement sealed by hongi and the exchange of gifts in the Māori system, called, of course, the Treaty of Waitangi. But the treaty never really got around to mediating this collision because the courts declared that it was a nullity, that the native title that it promised to guarantee was unenforceable except through transformational and extinguishing legislation, and that custom would only be recognised as a way of quickly evolving to the extinction of that culture and its assimilation. Māori rights, really of most kinds that weren't statutory, there were some statutory rights, but they were limited and problematic, were non-justiciable. And in a famous judgment, Chief Justice Prendergast in 1877 said the Crown, insofar as these rights are concerned, these claimed rights, these so-called rights, the Crown must acquit itself as best it may as the sole arbiter of its own justice. Famous case called Wiparata and the Bishop of Wellington. So it was that in this collision between Cook's Layer 2 and Kupe's Layer 1, Kupe's layer was almost entirely obliterated. On purpose. This was intentional. And it was the way of things in the 19th century. Racism was rife, social Darwinism was rife, and ultimately, although it was greatly to the settlers' benefit, they did really think that the obliteration of Kupe's law was going to be good for Kupe's descendants. But in 1985, things changed, around about 1985. And this is where you come in. Sorry, it's taken me 30 minutes to get this far. But I think that background is kind of important in trying to establish what I'm trying to establish. The third law of what I call Aotearoa New Zealand is born. The reinvention of the treaty as a creature of law, not just of the moral conscience of the Crown, and the creation of the treaty settlement process that begins to resource the 50 or 60 odd iwi groupings in the country. The rediscovery of native title in fisheries, foreshore and seabed, and more latterly, the argument over water. The reinvention of the Māori Land Court as a custom-perpetuating court, not a custom-destroying court. The reimposition of kinship, whanaungatanga, whānau hapu and iwi, into the work of the Family Court, and the Care of Children Act, the Children and Young Persons and Their Families Act, the introduction of kinship into sentencing law in Section 8 and Section 27 of the Sentencing Act, and so on and so on. All begins in around 1985, when, interestingly, the Fourth Labour government decides to give retrospective effect to the Treaty of Waitangi Act and sets off the treaty settlement process. For that decade, 1985 to 1995, my view is a grand conversation takes place between the iwi, Parliament, the judges and the Academy. and it lasts for a decade. And it places Kupe's Law, Mātauranga Māori, the name of this conference, back into the mainstream of legal and public discourse. And this is my point, sorry I've taken so long to get to it, the Resource Management Act is the crowning glory of that conversation, unquestionably. It is a sophisticated, multi-layered mandate for recovering the first law and making it live once more. Of course, it's joined by the other two horsemen, the Environment Act and the Conservation Act. But RMA is the first time anywhere in the Anglo-common law world, I suspect anywhere in the Western world, where anything this mainstream and this complicated had been attempted. I'm not sure we understood that at the time, but when you look at that document created in 1991, insofar as it relates to the first law of Aotearoa, it is extraordinary. How did it happen? Well, I guess New Zealand's in a search for itself at the time. Perhaps it's the rise of the Māori demograph, getting up around 10% by that time. Perhaps it's the civil rights movement in the States in the 60s and 70s. Probably the Springbok Tour helped, who knows. But in the following 20 years from RMA, you get HASNO, you get intellectual property changes, trademarks, patents, all have Māori, have first law clauses in them. Mental health legislation, movable cultural property legislation, and so on, and so on, and so on. But in the 175-year project of managing the collision between the first law and the second law, the Resource Management Act is unquestionably the flagship. Part 2 talks about, interestingly, this must have been a fluke, I don't know. Part 2, Section 6E, talks about the relationship between, Māori people and their lands, so on and so forth. You know the clause. Why they picked relationship, I don't know, but it, of course, completely replicates the kinship idea. One of those flukes of history, I suspect. It refers to kaitiakitanga, as you know, in Section 7, and to the treaty itself in Section 8. Section 33 talks about delegation of powers of decision-making. Two tribes, among other sections of the community. Heritage Protection Act provisions have the same idea. Section 36B talks about partnership management systems. And the Act is sold to Māori as a tino rangatiratanga opportunity, as the big game changer. You've spent the last 20 years, Ngānako Minhinik and all of those other Māoris, fighting us on this. Here's your big opportunity for kaitiakitanga to be delivered in practical terms. There are triggers in the regional and district plan provisions making the first law relevant, and there are iwi management plans, of course. The legislation enables much progress, unquestionably. We are a world away from where we were in 1975 as a result of this legislation. But, colleagues, I suggest to you, not enough has happened. I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way. I mean that the players still haven't understood, in my view, that they are managing the collision between legal systems and not just worldviews. They are managing a collision of laws, not just a collision of cultures in which one culture controls the law and the other just has culture. You see, since 1985, our system of law in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has become de facto, de jure, a dual system of law. And it was created by that grand decade-long conversation. RMA was the icebreaker. But in the last 20 years, that project, I say, has started to meander. Councils, and I should probably bracket ministers occasionally, haven't delivered the structural changes that Section 32, that the Heritage Protection Act provisions, that Section 36B all promised. Not one Section 33 delegation. Not one iwi Heritage Protection Authority. One, I think only one, partnership model under Section 36B, and that's only in respect of Māori land and taupo. Nothing except that. After 24 years. Judges and lawyers, but I'm going to take the hit here. Judges and lawyers have struggled to understand and apply first law principles as if they were law and entitled to be treated with that privilege. They've struggled even to see Kupe's principles as law at all. And that's not the iwi, in my view, are partly to blame as well. Sorry, Tauranga Moana. Because I think the iwi have lacked vision and they've lacked capacity to push the opportunities in that act to where they should be taken. So what's happened? Well, you see, the ideas haven't been lost, and someone's going to talk about this later on, because what's happened is Wellington has stepped in the treaty settlements process to correct what is undoubtedly, in my view, a system failure. We now have the Urewera legislation, which makes the national park a person. Completely mainstream first law. Completely mainstream first law. Incredibly innovative in the second law. Waikato River, the Waikato River settlement, which you'll all know about, and it's going to be talked about later on, and the Whanganui River settlement, which will make the river a person. Once again, completely mainstream Kupe law, innovative Cook law. So that's great that Wellington has stepped in and with iwi assistance helped to deliver what RMA should have delivered over the last 20 years. The problem is that the result is a little lumpy. The big guys get to do well in that system because they've got the heft. The little guys, Manaia Creek, where I come from, isn't going to get a legal personality. Even though we love that river with all our hearts. We call it a river, it's actually a creek. We call it a river. And of course, this is kind of in principle problematic from my point of view. The iwi have had to spend treaty settlement credits to get what RMA promised they'd get. And that's not fair, it seems to me. So, colleagues, the 20-year experiment has advanced, and we ought to be positive about that. But it hasn't advanced in the pace or entirely with the pace or entirely in the direction that those who created it in 1991 would have wanted. But it's not too late. There's still much to do. So much of it actually depends on the skill set in this room. That's the kind of mundane, prosaic reality of these things. You can have you can own the flashiest car, but if you can't drive, the car isn't going anywhere. And in some ways, RMA is a little like that. We didn't really know how to drive it. What we need, actually, looking back at the way in which this collision has taken place over the last 175 years, is bilegal, sounds a little LGBT, doesn't it? Bilegal lawyers, planners, resource managers, and judges. Without us achieving bilegality, and by that I mean comfort and understanding in both systems, this grand experiment will ultimately fail. Or perhaps it might, no, that's what I wrote fail, but I think the better thing to say is it will fall well short of the try line. We have to learn to find comfort, all of us, whatever culture we come from, whatever legal training we have, whatever planning training, resource management training, science training we have to learn comfort in wearing two lenses. This, ladies and gentlemen, will be our point of difference. This will make us truly unique, at least in the Anglo common law world. You see, quantum physicists say that when two complex systems are encouraged to collide in a managed way, extraordinary things can be created. something greater than the sum of the parts of those two laws. And I think with a little effort and some upskilling of the skill set in this room, we can create something truly beautiful. What Bikrunga would call a beautiful collision. Thank you very much. Kia ora. Oh, tō tātou.
I've got time for 2 or 3 questions, if you have any, for Judge Williams. So 2 or 3 questions. There is a microphone there and a microphone there. Please feel free to do so. Thank you. We have one here, and if there's one there, you can. Thank you.
Kia ora. Klaus Hosselmann from Auckland University. Justice Williams, I'd like to say, first of all, I've been in the field of environmental law for 40 years. I have listened to many, many talks about environmental law. This is the single best one I've ever heard. My compliment.
Thank you, Klaus. That's
not well, a question. I find it very helpful to refer to law in Maori traditions as the first law, and we are now sort of trying to marry the first and the second law to something very beautiful. I'm interested in your comment on the Pākehā approach that led to the introduction of the sustainability principle in the Resource Management Act. We know in international law that there is a strong body of thought suggesting that sustainability is about relationships.
Yes.
It is at its core the integrity, using some Western jargon here, the integrity of systems, of living systems, of human systems, of ecological systems. That being the case, how do you rate our chances that we were world first in introducing sustainability as a core idea around sustainable management? How do you rate the chances that this kind of wisdom that has been discovered in any other cultures, not just obviously indigenous cultures, but also in Western cultures and European cultures, how do you rate our chances that we have this kind of ability to pull it through and to really discover that we have actually a commonality across cultures?
I think what are the chances that any humans would get there now? To be fair, they're probably not great, but of all of the human communities, perhaps optimistic, but I don't think so. My view is that our human community is the one most likely to get there, because the evolving Western view of these things synergizes and synthesizes rather well with the homegrown view. So that, it's like, an idea just popped into my head. You remember Braveheart, which is one of my favorite movies? The British send the Irish out as the cannon fodder, and the Irish go rushing towards the Scots, and the Scots come rushing towards them, and as they come together, instead of crossing blades and whacking one another, they all hug one another. Do you remember that? Well, it's because the Irish had decided to change sides, bless them. So I think there's a real possibility here that in this collision, I know it's been going on for a while, but in this collision as it's happening in this third phase, we'll come together and hug one another, rather than there being, contact and destruction. And I've just come from the Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association conference in Wellington, and we had a pōhiri, not unlike this one, and the majority of the judges were from Africa, North America, the Caribbean, Australasia, and of course Britain. And something that we would think is just kind of normal. They are just blown away. Just blown away by it. Now, how have you guys achieved this? You know, the Australians, of course, struggle with it. No, they do. They do. There were some Australians in tears as they watched 160 kids on the stage with the Prime Minister sing the national anthem in Māori and English. You know, it was ho-hum. And we forget that. We forget, actually, that we're starting to learn how to enjoy this collision, I think. So thanks for the question, Klaus, and for the compliment. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you. I might take one more just over there. Did I see someone down there in the gazing? Thank you. Tēnā koe.
Justice Williams, Rosemary Dixon is my name.
Kia ora, Rosemary.
I'm very interested in the idea that the RMA in 1991 promised much but has failed to deliver in terms of promising the synthesis of the two laws that you've described. If it hadn't failed to deliver, if we hadn't fallen short of the try line, what do you think should have happened in the 20 years before the government needed to step in and do the other things that you've talked about? What sorts of things would we have seen?
I expect that district plans and regional plans in particular, and perhaps national policy statements, would have reflected certainly the personality idea attaching to the great river systems of our country. I expect that iconic landscapes and waterscapes would have been the subject of Section 33 delegations or Section 36 partnership models, not unlike that created in respect of the Waikato River, which I admit is a very big and complex system, both physically and in terms of the humans that are managing it. So I would have expected a lot of those outcomes, valley by valley, would have been able to occur through the ordinary systems of the RMA, rather than in negotiation and special legislation.
I'll have one more short one. Tēnā koe.
Ke kona.
Yep.
Tēnā koe, Justice Williams. My relation, Awanui, spoke about how iwi in the Environment Court have almost been a victim of it, and you have spoken about the struggle that justices and judges are taking. Could you explain why the struggle is there?
Well, you probably couldn't hear that down the back, but the questioner asked why it is that, as Awanui Black reflected, iwi are largely unsuccessful in the Environment Court, and why it is that I think, anyway, judges are struggling with first law ideas. I've actually written about this in a paper that's in the Waikato Law Review, and Justice Whata has taken it up and written extensively about it. So you should, if you're really interested in that question, and he's going to speak about it today. So he'll give you the chapter and verse about all the cases. I didn't have them in my paper, and certainly didn't have time. What I see in the Environment Court cases and in the Superior Court cases on appeals is some judges grappling brilliantly with Kupe's law. There's the Wanganui, the Taupō Tongariro reconsenting decision at Environment Court level. It fails in the High Court and the Court of Appeal, but at Environment Court level, if you read that decision, you see the judge really getting what the river means to these people. And in a case called Ngāti Hokopu, you see a judge giving what I think is one of the best summaries of how you deal with Māori law, Māori custom, Māori tradition on its own terms. Not through a Western lens, but on its own terms, that I've read anywhere, actually. But they tend to be the exception. Generally speaking, judges, just like the rest of us, haven't made the leap yet. So they're sceptical of taniwha stories, understandably. Why wouldn't they be? They're Western trained and probably secular lives. They're sceptical of taniwha stories as, cooked up to extort some money from transit or whatever it might be. And, we do have to be careful about that. But actually, there are a lot of taniwha stories in this country, lots and lots, that aren't cooked up, that are 1,000 years old. And judges struggle with that, just as ordinary New Zealanders struggle with it. Now, I think judges are entitled to be sceptical where the story is cooked up, but they don't yet have the tools to identify a cooked up one from a not cooked up one. And that's because the systems of testing in Kupe's law, it's not as if these sorts of problems didn't arise in the first law, and the communities had ways of dealing with them. You're cooking up that whakapapa, you don't own that land. That's not your river. Don't talk to me about taniwhas. There's never been a story about that taniwha. Right? You just made that up. These are debates that the Māori community has had itself for 1,000 years. And they've worked out systems to find out where the truth lies, at least in terms of Kupe's law version of the truth. For the most part, judges and lawyers and resource managers don't know how to do that. Where they did, if they did, we'd accept the ones that are credible in that system and reject the ones that are not. And over the next decade, we're going to have to learn to do that. To work in that system. That's why I say that we have a dual legal system now, not just in resource management, everywhere, but particularly in resource management because it was the first and the most sophisticated. And we have to learn to work in that system in order to discern truth and to find merit. Not find truth and merit outside the system and then impose it on it, because that will produce injustice, just as Awanui said. Hapai? All right, thank you very much.
If I might just come back and, mind you, I've heard a lot of the answers. Originally, I asked, as I'm asking all presenters, for you, what would be a good outcome from this hui, Justice Williams? I don't know if you can encapsulate that in a short one.
Yes, I'm...
It's hard.
Yeah, I'm worse than Awa.
That's all right.
I just go on and on and on. I think the answer actually is quite simple, that system failure has occurred not through the structures of the system, but through failure of implementation. And failure of implementation is almost always a human failure, not a system failure. And I think the basic problem we have is with the skill set in this room, and with your colleagues, and my colleagues. And by upskilling, by learning, change will occur naturally and evolutionarily, excuse the bad English, over the next generation.
That's a good response. 2 worlds, 2 laws, managed collision. Please thank my first presenter, Justice Joe Williams.